Geoff's an author, Geoff Payne, an author of over 100 scientific papers and patents, and has written articles in the popular press. He's been on the TV on Four Corners and 7:30 on a wide range of topics, including toxic industrial pollution. His interests are maths, physics, information science, biochemistry, chemistry. He's got a PhD in chemical synthesis, structural characterization of new organometallic molecules in unusual structures with fluxonial behaviour. I can't wait to read that one, Geoff. Anyway, Geoff's going to be talking about the NHMRC. Thank you, Geoff.
Thank you very much. Now, please don't panic when you see some of my slides because they break every rule in the lecturer's book. These slides will be available permanently to the world, and so you can go back and study them at your leisure. However, I think that it's good to aggregate the information, because you can't take a linear approach to the story I'm going to tell. It's a matrix approach, and you'll need to look at it from different angles coming in if you're interested in thinking about this further. So you can follow me on Twitter. I'm active, and I chose the handle Fluoride Poison for a deliberate reason, because the only real interest I had in Twitter was to experiment and to enter the field and to see what was being said to the customers of Twitter about fluoride. So I'm going to be quite forthright today in my attack on the National Health and Medical Research Council. Today at 3 p.m, a press release becomes unembargoed from me calling for a joint parliamentary inquiry into fluoridation in Australia and its health effects. And the reason that I want to do that is that the National Health and Medical Research Council currently refuses to see evidence, and I'll be showing you details of that. They refuse to hear scientists when they come to Sydney, for example. We'll have no NHMRC people here today, and they refuse to speak to anyone, and there's a blanket order on the NHMRC people from communicating with any member of the public, let alone a scientist. The history here, which I'll flash through, Australia was fluoridated in stages. I think as part of a coordinated campaign, the early fluoridation of a town in New Zealand and Beaconsfield in Tasmania were probably related activities. Both had hydroelectric energy resources useful to the aluminium industry. You can see from the map the year of introduction and the parts per million dosage. And this is 2005 data, official data, so, but it's still reasonable. Subsequent to this, of course, the notorious forced mandatory fluoridation of Queensland was implemented by the Bligh government. Now, the significant thing to note here is the different doses. Darwin at 0.6, Tasmania at 1.1. And this was done, as you'll see shortly, for a crude attempt to counter the fact that it was known that people in hot weather drink more. So we started in 1954, we now have official documents released under Freedom of Information, and we're continuing the attempt to get documents. Some have been withheld still. But in 1954, the NHMRC referred to fluoride storage toxicity risk. That's the term they used. They were aware, in particular, cane cutters in Queensland would drink perhaps 10 litres of water per day. Recent mining studies have shown that Australian miners sometimes drink 12 litres a day, is fairly common. And they were aware that tea was one of your major sources of fluoride storage toxicity, and they were estimating a crude estimate with an assumed low 0.5 ppm in the background water and a tea consumption that was known of the average tea cutter, an input of about 16.5. If you convert to a higher dose in the background, you're getting about 20 milligrams per day of fluorine. So, once again, don't panic, this is available, but I thought I'd show a complete abstract of a scientific paper by one of the nation's heroes. Professor Holman and his colleague here from the School of Population Health at the University of Western Australia are not conspiracy theorists, they're conspiracy factists. They actually measure corruption within government in the field of public health and the deliberate suppression by Australian governments of public health information. Now, to save time, the net result is that the corrupt people in public health in Australia, those administrators, succeed 87% of the time in suppressing vital health information from the public. Now, WikiLeaks, of course, on the international level was one of the great heroes as well. In 2009, they released a document that was never meant to see the light of day, United States Congressional Report from the Services Department, their background in government and technical aspects of the impact of fluoridation and regulation. So, good on WikiLeaks. Getting back to the NHMRC locally, suppression, once again I've outlined, you can read this later at your leisure, just flying through it. 1953, the NHMRC endorsed fluoridation as safe. The meeting minutes are still confidential from that meeting. In 1959, there was a challenging paper by a marvellous man called Dr. Philip Sutton, and he published a book, and it was published by Melbourne University Press. The Dental Research Committee of the NHMRC wanted to attack Dr. Sutton, so they referred it to a subcommittee for 4 years, and they never made the report of a so-called attack of his work public. And one of the backers of and colleagues of Dr. Sutton was in fact the Dean of the Faculty of Dental Science at the University of Melbourne, who was a fierce opponent of introducing fluoride in any form. Subsequently, we've obtained under Freedom of Information the 1953 minutes, and the key point at the bottom of this slide is that they said if we're going to put fluoridation into the Australian public, we have to, one, have a large section of the community asking for it, and two, we can't have any significant number of people opposed to it. In 1964, just after that period, we had the National Guinea Pig Bank, which was held for animal experimentation, virtually wiped out. So thousands and thousands of guinea pigs were killed, and the reason was traced, after a long time, to fluoride-contaminated phosphate supplements given to them to keep them going. They died in up to 20 days. They were not euthanized. In Queensland, the background is that natural water throughout Queensland grazing areas is heavily contaminated bore water in fluoride. And here's an official government report showing the effect on the jaw and the teeth of sheep in fluoridated, damaged versus non-fluorised areas. So this is useful background for you to consider reality, economic reality, political reality. 1991, the NHMRC had a committee of different people, of course, and they said that claims of fluoride sensitivity, so that bell curve distribution and margin of safety that Will talked about, they recognised that that must be investigated and quantified. They also wanted autopsy data to be collected in a progressive study, deliberately looking for damage, which they anticipated. They also recognised that those with renal impairment are particularly vulnerable to fluoride. Now, the Australian Drinking Water Guidelines 2004, which is published with the collaboration and cooperation of the NHMRC, talked about the increasing progressive risk of skeletal fluorosis, not tooth fluorosis, but skeletal. And they referred to the US EPA results, and they say that people with impaired kidney function accumulate in their bodies for life fluoride at perhaps 3 times normal. So this is what the Australian government knows. Now, moving on to the 2007 notorious NHMRC report. They invited tenders, they didn't advertise it. The successful tenderer was given just 2 months, including the Christmas holiday period, to write the entire report. Internal memos showed that breached government tender rules. The tenderer was part of a US group, which personally I'm interested in, but you might think is irrelevant. They quickly identified using an international database called PubMed, over 5,000 publications that were relevant to fluoride toxicology within the period that they had decided to cover, and they whittled that down to 77. The authors I list there. Now, here they are proudly boasting in an internal document obtained from Freedom of Information how they took 5,418 retrieved non-duplicate citations. They then, under their very unusual criteria, identified 400 and so potentially relevant abstracts, and they got the 77, and from that they identified some harms. So now we have the internal understanding of what they were considering, even though they'd whittled it down to 77 papers out of over 5,000. Fracture, cancer, and other harms. On this chart, you'll see that this has been redacted, so the identity of the person presenting this slide is hidden. So, if we look at the report, and you can obtain both the Part A and Part B free download still from the NHMRC website, and you can read it in its entirety and make up your own minds. But I've been through and I analysed. So, kidney makes one mention as a vital organ, and that was in the context of kidney stones being a harm that was known to come from fluoride. The word renal makes one appearance only out of all the literature, and that was in the context of they deliberately excluded the word renal from any study. Toxicity, when dealing with a known poison, appeared once in the whole document. And I'll show you here, this is the lethal dose against the plaque. That's enough fluoride to kill 50% of you here. The lethal dose is defined as the LD50. So if you'd like to flip a coin, whether that dose will kill you or the person sitting next to you. It wasn't considered in the report. There are no mentions of the liver, no mentions of DNA. What makes you you? How would fluoride potentially affect your reproduction system and your replication of DNA to make your new cells? The fetus receives no mention at all. There's no mention of the breast. I'll be getting onto that later. I'm halfway through. Thank you. There's no mention of human milk, and there's no mention at all of the pineal gland. However, close reading of the report does identify harms that were analysed just from the 77 papers out of the 5,418. All of those harms listed were identified in the 2007 report. Those with asterisks and in bold were identified by the NHMRC with its flawed approach as having statistically significant increased prevalence. Now, as a chemist, I won't bore you too much, but I'm interested in crystal lattices, and I'm using the term the fuss. What's all the fuss about? Well, it's fluoride in unwanted substitution sites. This is a staring down on one face of the hydroxyapatite crystal, and the different atoms are marked there. And this is relevant because the blue dots are the, oops, I'll go back. Sorry, the blue dots are the hydroxide. The dentist will tell you, or the promoters of fluoride will tell you that fluoride will come along to that crystal and substitute into the crystal, and they claim in some papers as far as 6 lattice constants deep. I'm getting a bit technical here, but that's on flawed evidence, which I will possibly go into in questions. What I want to draw your attention to is that this mineral, fluorine-doped hydroxyapatite, grows as crystals, the green, whoops, sorry, I'm a bit, where's my, anyway, on the right-hand side, the green crystal there, you can see it's long, flat, and pointy. This is highly relevant. Now, another aspect of fuss, that is fluoride substitution, this is a document that the NMRC, I can promise you, will not want you to see. This is recent data using healthy volunteers to have put into their bodies radioactive fluorine. And the dark areas is where that radioactive fluorine has gone a short time after it's been put into the body. And we can tell this is a man. I won't tell you how you can work that out. But I'd like to draw your attention to the bone, the spine, the hips. But the blackest area on the whole chart is the bladder. The human body, when it's confronted with a toxin, very often tries to get rid of it in urine. And so you can see that shortly after the fluorine has been put into the human body, the body is desperately trying to get this fluorine out of the body. But it doesn't succeed. And it lodges everywhere where there's a high calcium exposed area, and you can see the kidneys in this diagram as well. Note also the joints, and in particular the femoral arteries. Very interesting. You can see the base of the brain illuminated here. That may well be the pineal gland coming through, because we're picking up all the particles from these volunteers being hit on the detector. So, now we move on to the latest research that I have found that's relevant. I can say quite simply that FUS causes malignant breast cancer because it's been published by people with whom I have no relation in a peer-reviewed journal of nuclear medicine. And what they have found is that if you have calcium deposits in your breasts and they are made of hydroxyapatite, you have a much higher chance of getting breast cancer because the presence of that material in your breasts accelerates tumour growth. Now, if you have calcium precipitates in your breast of calcium oxalate, that does not occur. So there's something unique about fluoride hydroxyapatite. Now, this is very uncomfortable for a lot of people I know, but you have to understand that if you're going to have a look at it, T is one of your major inputs of fluoride, and we can say categorically now with a long-term study of 61,000 people that over 17 years that you have a much higher incidence of breast cancer if you drink tea. And what I'm saying, the authors did not say, but what I'm saying, that directly links to the fluoride consumption, which directly links to the precipitation of microcrystals in the breasts. We were asking before whether the fluoride can get into the brain. Well, this is proof positive, using the same technique, radioactive fluorine. If you take a mouse in this case, there's a substance in the middle diagram pointed out as the corpora arenaceae, which is called brain sand. And this is insoluble precipitates of calcium to which the radioactive fluorine is attracted. And so you have an absolute proof that the fluorine is getting directly into the brain of the mouse. Now, I'll skip over this probably because we're running out of time, but the key thing I wanted to mention is apart from the fluoride phosphate industry, there's another key driver, and that's the huge stocks of uranium from the Manhattan Project and afterwards. The bulk of uranium mined in the world is converted to this gas, which has to be contained. The bulk of it is completely useless. There have been a couple of approaches to getting rid of it. One is genotoxic uranium warheads, but then the question is what to do with the fluorine. Running with that is that the ozone layer is attacked by fluorocarbons, so the market for fluorocarbon refrigerants has collapsed. You've got a population explosion leading to more waste generation from phosphate fertiliser, which is running out. Contrary to that, you've got tough environmental laws. You've got dentists trying to make an extra buck by selling you rinses, gels and varnishes, and we've got engineering firms who want to make money out of making plant. Now, I will just skip over this one very briefly, but one of the politicians that I've had something to do with in his book outlined his approach to introducing fluoride in Victoria. He knew that the people of Victoria would never vote for the introduction of fluoridation, and so he and his other colleagues conspired to prevent a referendum. Christine Milne of the Greens has a mind like a steel trap. She has stated that the science of fluoridation is settled. Now, that's very interesting. I'll get onto that later, make it a question. But anyway, the Greens in particular, you would think, I would be worried about the slaughtering of our icon. Alcoa emissions at Portland have killed and crippled hundreds and hundreds of kangaroos, which all had to be shot by professional shooters. You can look that up on the web. I won't have time to go through the individuals concerned, but my point is here that we're dealing with a very small group of people who are making this decision for 25 million Australians. I have here from the FOI quotes from Poltics that were discussed in the minutes of an important meeting in July 2013, and they were aware of the Harvard neurotoxicology study. They talked about the cost of fluoridation in plants. They talked about the Greens in particular. So here you have a group of people who are meant to be scientists talking about the internal politics of the Greens. They then discussed regional issues, which we'll go into, but importantly, I'll draw your attention to the bottom of the slide. They discussed in the official minutes of this meeting Dr. Paul Connett and his document 50 Reasons to Oppose Fluoridation. Once again, we had reports on the fact that they were now concerned because they were getting one freedom of information application per week since Queensland amended legislation to compel fluoridation. And there's other things. They also were aware, at that stage, Israel were having problems, as they put it, because of thyroid disease links and harms to the fetus. Subsequently, of course, as almost none of you know, Israel banned, until today, you heard probably for the first time, Israel banned fluoridation in August 2014. They also identified toothpaste as the major problem for fluorosis. in Australia. They referred to a PubMed search on neurotoxicology and renal toxicology. And they have more details for you to read later. They talk about managing public perception, consumer messaging, and they finally got around to talk about children. And they talk about the Australian Drinking Water Guidelines have not been reviewed for some time. Now I can tell you one of the key problems the NHMRC has at the moment, they are considering going to a uniform dosing rate into the water across Australia. That they have a lot of internal problems about that, because they know that if they go to the Darwin level, that it will be an effective reduction of 50% for Tasmanians, or if they go to the Tasmanian level, it will be a doubling for the people in far north Queensland or Northern Territory. So they can't actually do either. They're in a political fix. I'm carrying on flicking through slides here because we're talking about subjects which may be considered in the 2015 review. So they discussed the 2015 and 2015 review in 2013, topics which may be discussed. They've subsequently decided not to discuss any of these topics in the actual review. This is an example of a requested document under FOI. This is what I'm talking about, absolute proof. If you were doubting what I was saying and what Darcy Holman said about suppression succeeding 87% of the time, I ask you, I challenge everyone here, just look at what your public servants are doing to you, the people who are being dosed. And the subject matter is actually, if you read the one paragraph they left out, children's development and IQ. Criminal. So, the NHMRC has failed, no weight of evidence, it ignores the basic precautionary principle, ignores medical ethics, it perpetuates fiction that fluoride is a nutrient, it ignores vulnerable groups, and it does embrace fluoridation like a religion. Once again, if you're going to do weight of evidence, you start at the molecular level, and you work your way through to the body and the population level. The NHMRC does not initiate or even consider many of these aspects. Now, 12 of the current committee are known fluoride promoters. And here is a document for you to just, my time is up, but maybe we'll stop at this point because we can carry on. But it's important that you consider the network of how exactly does Australia come to be fluoridated, and 97% of humanity is not. And in fact, we can leave up while we're answering questions.
Okay, are there any questions? Just come back.
Thank you, Dr. Payne. I was just wondering if you could comment to the audience, perhaps one of your earlier slides that was talking to renal impairment. I noticed that it was a level of 4 milligrams per litre, but you didn't necessarily specify that 1 part per million in the water is 4,000 times less than that. So
not 4,000, just 4 times. So in the United States, it's legal to supply water to Americans at 4 parts per million or 4 milligrams per litre.
Are you talking about water fluoridation?
Yeah, we're talking about fluoridation here, water fluoridation. It is known that...
So in milligrams per mil, how much is our water fluoridation?
Sorry, how many milligrams per mil?
I'm asking you, in Australia, in milligrams per litre, which is what you quoted, how many milligrams per litre do we have of fluoride in our water?
The legal...
No, how many, when you were saying it's...
In Australia, we have 1.5 is the guideline. There is actually...
That's parts per million. That's not milligrams per
litre.
litre.
They are equivalent. They're exactly equivalent. 1 milligram per litre is 1 part per million.
Correct. So when you're talking here of 4 milligrams per litre...
That was from a US study which I quoted in its entirety without editing. And as Professor Conrad pointed out, 4 is allowed in the United States. It is not allowed in this country. However, there is more politics to that because some Aboriginal communities in Western Australia were living in an environment where they got 4, and the government then sent bottled water to them, realising that there were health symptoms appearing in those communities. And in Gwyndellup in Western Australia, there was high natural groundwater fluoride, and the Western Australian government spent many, many millions of dollars in setting up a plant to take fluoride out of the water to get it under what they considered was dangerous, but certainly no more than 1.5. So at great cost, Gwyndellup is supplied with filtered water where the fluoride has been largely taken out.
And could you comment, for example, if someone was to take on a regular basis 4 times the amount of recommended dose of vitamin C or antibiotics, would that be a health risk as well?
You'd have to look at the individual one. I know that some people have said you can take massive amounts of vitamin C. However, that's challenged by real science. So if you examine recommendations, they certainly don't recommend what Linus Pauling, for example, recommended many years ago, that you could eat 40 grams of vitamin C a day.
No, I'm understanding that if you use the recommended amount of vitamin C, it has health benefits, but if you have 4 times that amount, or maybe 40 times that
yes,
amount...
taking too much of anything can be a problem, and vitamin C can form insoluble salts in your kidneys,
yes,
which can then lead to
harmful effects if it's taken way too high a level. Could
yes.
I just ask you one quick question on this final slide? What is the relevance of Colgate Oral Care on that slide?
Yes, excellent. If I had more time today, but you'll be able to read the full context here. Colgate has established professors of dentistry at Australian universities, Melbourne, Sydney, Adelaide, and it has used those centres through mechanisms such as the Conversation, which is published by Melbourne University, to allow pro-fluoridation people to promote the perceived benefits of fluoridation, but blocks out people who are not currently in academic employment in Australia. So, for example, I cannot write a counter-argument to the professor, the Colgate professor, and have it published under the same conditions. I can only respond as a comment on their paper.
Given that this talk and this conference is about water fluoridation, could you still clarify what Colgate Oral Care...
Yes, I'll clarify. I was actually invited to speak to this topic. It was not my idea, but I was very pleased to, because I'm very interested in politics. So let me make it absolutely clear. You can't separate politics, you can't separate corporations, you can't separate the suppression of public health information from corporations and government.
I just don't understand why one company has its...
They effectively control, let's just put it this way, Adelaide University receives vast sums of money from Colgate and the taxpayers, and if I can quickly go, oh, here we go, I have the slide here. Where do you think that is? It's not Colgate corporate headquarters, that's Adelaide University.
And what is the relevance of that?
The relevance of that is corporatisation of our universities by people who benefit from selling a substance which we know causes harm. And here's a scale of taxpayer money in comparison to Colgate Oral Care's donation. Colgate puts in about $2.158 million compared to the taxpayer putting in about $30 million in supporting the fluoridation industry in Australia. Would you like me to say more about Colgate?
If you'd like to, yes.
I'll go back some slides because I'm glad this has come up and gives me an opportunity. We have currently the big lie, which was referred to on that chart. The big lie is that fluoride is a nutritional, valuable element, and currently we have people from Colgate-sponsored positions sitting on the fluoride committee of the Fluoride Standards Australia and New Zealand, and they are saying that it's okay to have 10 milligrams per day for a 76 kilogram man, and it's okay for 10 milligrams per day to a 60 kilogram woman. This is the official machinations of the Colgate experts who are sitting on the committee, and they are talking about 10 milligrams. Well, for those of you who don't cope with small numbers or are staggered, that's 300 million atoms of fluoride toxin per day that they're recommending. And they are trying to create a lie that claims that you have to have an adequate daily input of 4 milligrams for a man and 3 for a woman. you can see the inconsistency, how stupid they are. They're fools, and I use the word on here, and he may quote me. They say that a woman can have 3 milligrams a day adequate, and a man 4, and they say that a woman, smaller, who should have a smaller adequate, they reckon she can tolerate a higher dose. There's no science about that. Women are not more resistive to the poison. I mean, it's absolutely staggering. They should consider that the lethal dose.
We have another question up here, Geoff.
Hi Geoff, I'm just wondering how, with the 2007 NHMRC report came out, did they pay any attention at all to the 2006 NRC report, which, if I'm right, didn't that advise that the EPA should look more closely at fluoridation in the US?
Yes, absolutely. Paul touched on this. They dismissed the entire 500-page, 3.5-year input expert report by the National Research Council of the United States in a single paragraph. And particularly, even more wicked, and I use that word advisedly, they excluded all references in that 2006 report. So the 2007 report was not allowed to consider the literature up until the point of 2006, and likewise we now have an attempt to bury that information because the current review, 2015, will not take any information published after November 2006. So they're neatly sidestepping once again, handballing it away and preventing people considering it. So the NHMRC, on the issue of renal failure induced by fluoride, you can inject a rat with sodium fluoride and you can guarantee kidney damage. It's 100%. And they excluded deliberately over 30 papers on low dose impact of fluoride in animals and people from fluoride, on the kidney particularly.
Yes, Dr. Payne. I'm Terry Bowd. I'm a candidate, a Greens candidate in the New South Wales state elections. I agree with you fully about the problems with the Greens party, but they don't reflect my ideas. I'm having a lot of trouble with them, and perhaps I shouldn't be making a public statement like this because I've been asked while I'm a candidate I shouldn't say anything about fluoride or shouldn't try to embarrass the Greens. I'm not trying to embarrass the Greens except to say I agree with you. Christine Mill's view is what you stated. John Kay's view, and he's standing in the state government, in the upper house. Very intelligent, capable man, but he's been caught by, I guess, the bureaucracy or whatever. He claims the science is on the side of pro-fluoridation. It's the only problem I have with him. Other than that, he's a brilliant person and he should be re-elected. But he needs to be worked on seriously. So does Christine, and so does her advisor, Richard Denari, Senator Richard Denari, who's a doctor, and he's the one who's advising him. So, but let me put it straight. The Greens are reflecting the community attitudes. So I think they will change, unlike the other parties, more so when the community changes. It seems that way. So I suppose they're reflecting grassroots, which is a Greens principle. But you say you're a member of the Labor Party, I read that there. The Labor Party in New South Wales and in Queensland are the worst in many ways with regard to fluoridation.
Oh, I agree, 100%.
Oh, good, terrific, good. So I'm just trying to get the political situation correct. And it's surprising that the Liberals are more reasonable about it because they say give the community a choice. Whereas we basically, under the previous Labor government in Queensland, you didn't have a choice, and for all intents and purposes in New South Wales, you don't have a choice. I believe in Victoria, I think that has been said today, you don't have a choice. I'm not sure about the other states. But your approach was very political. I think that's good, it's important, and if we're talking about it in NHMRC, it's got to be political. You won't get a change unless you get a change in the politics, in political thinking. Because the politicians are going to tell the bureaucrats that they want the real facts. And I I think that how are the politicians going to change? From the community. So it's a community education issue and challenge. And, yeah. Sorry about that, Paul.
Thanks. I'll just briefly respond to that if you don't mind, Ron. That was an excellent summation of the politics. We should pay tribute to the politically late Campbell Newman, who, when coming into office, rescinded and applies mandatory fluoridation requirement in Queensland. And subsequently, to date, I'm aware of 43 local councils have opted to protect their citizens and either turned off or refused to implement the previous mandatory order to poison their ratepayers.
Sorry, 24 councils, but that's...
Oh, it's 24, so I'm standing corrected. Somewhere I saw it, but I'm only too happy to be corrected, and that's good.
More than 45 towns.
More than 45 towns. Yeah. And that's very encouraging. So, as Barry Jones said, all those years ago when he was deliberately preventing people from having their opinion measured, give people a referendum and that will end fluoridation in the vast majority of local communities. But I say that the government needs to act today, call an immediate moratorium and tell every dosing plant in the country to turn off the dosing tap. It's not going to cost a cent to do that. We just stop the input of the poison overnight. What it needs is a bold, courageous leadership in government. Unfortunately, we don't have that at the moment. I'll probably drop dead tomorrow if Tony Abbott announces that he's personally concerned that the evidence presented and he wants to go down the Israeli government path and cancel fluoridation in one hit.
I'd just like to make a comment to follow up the other gentleman's comment. I'm from Geelong, Victoria, and we have a number of key Liberal people down there, and privately they will admit they're against it, but publicly they will not stand up. In regards to the Greens Party, I know someone who tried to get a working party up in Victoria on this issue, and she was sabotaged. So there was a bit of skullduggery around that. And it's very clear there is a lot of politics at work here, but it's not obvious unless you're really looking for it.
Thank you. On that subject, I've got a list in the document that you can access later of 17 identified political heroes who were fierce opponents, either dead or alive, of fluoridation, including the former Premier of Victoria, Sir Henry Poltics, the former Premier of Western Australia, Sir James Killen. I won't read them all out. Getting back to the comment from the gentleman from the Greens, the Catcher Australia Party is the only political party that I'm aware of in Australia that has a policy against fluoridation. They now have 2 members in the Queensland government. They oppose fluoridation because they established a fundamental set of principles when they formed a party in the name of Bob Katter, and those principles they adhere to. One of those is that forced medication is an absolute no-no. So I'm hoping that the 2 capped members of the Queensland Parliament can now create a lot of trouble for the Labor Party, which has a slim majority government with the cooperation of 1 independent. I'm hoping that the independent can be persuaded with the capped members to make sure that that mandatory fluoridation in Queensland is not brought back in, as some stupid ALP candidate said in the last election campaign.
It's interesting, the whole topic of the influence of corporations on public health messages, and it's a favourite topic of mine actually, but one classic example was the American Paediatric Society in 2003 made a statement which I don't think anybody would argue with, and that is that carbonated drinks, soft drinks, cause tooth decay. And then in 2004 Pepsi Cola donated $1 million to that organisation, and by the end of 2004 the statement went something like, the science is now unclear as to the exact role of carbonated drinks and soft drinks on tooth decay. Now there's one example of something that I doubt whether anybody in this room would argue about. I mean, we know soft drinks cause tooth decay, but $1 million seemed to be enough to cause the American Paediatric Society to change its public health message. That's just a very small example, and I do think the role of corporations in public health is a major, major challenge for all of us. But that's a whole story, that's a whole other conference perhaps. Any other questions? Yes, Bill would like to make us.
one comment to follow up on yours. The profits made by the phosphate industry disposing of their hazardous waste in the public water supplies is $300 million ching-ching every year. So there are lots of opportunities to buy public health policies to keep their business model operating.
Well, there's no doubt that we've got a great economic model happening. It may just not be a very good health model.
I was wondering if you have a figure at all on what the storage costs are in the settling ponds for them to store the fluoride as opposed to dumping it in our water supplies.
Yeah, that's a very interesting, once again, political situation in New South Wales here. The Shire of Burke was fined by the the New South Wales CPA for dumping fluoride in its municipal tip, which was described as surplus to their requirements. And a brave ABC reporter got that onto online, but it wasn't very widely broadcast. The fact is that the phosphate mineral supply is running out in Western Australia. It's likely that the current producer of hydrofluorosilicic acid won't be able to produce anymore at one stage. We may actually have a natural death in that state to the fluoridation. And as Paul said, you cannot legally dump it anywhere in the world in the sea. You can't dump it anywhere in the world at land. If you do decide to dump, you're going to have to do some processing to make it less soluble. The quickest way is to add lime, and that reduces it, but that's still, calcium fluoride is still soluble, as we know, because we know that mineral water, where the water runs through fluoridated rocks, picks up a fluorine. So after precipitating this liquid captured scrubber waste and stabilising it by making a solid, we then have to consolidate the solid by drying, and then, in my view, we need to bury it for all time in a triple confinement system, as is used for radioactive waste.
So it's a very expensive process.
Yes, but with the prospect of litigation on the scene, I think that the government is now vulnerable to class action, and I think that they would be extremely worried once the broader community becomes fully aware of the whole issue, from the phosphate rock through to the human suffering, that the economics will take over, and that that scrubber waste will be converted into insoluble, unleachable, permanently stored waste.
I'm not sure if this is sort of your area of expertise or sort of getting too much off the track, but you and a number of other speakers have mentioned tea and the fluoride in tea. As a keen tea drinker and one of millions of Australians that drink a lot of it, can you expand on that? Is it, I think you mentioned black tea in your slide. Is it all fermentations of the Camellia sinensis plant, white tea, green tea, oolong tea? And is it a product of the plant itself? Is it how it's grown? Is it where it's grown? What sort of levels are they in comparison to water? And
it's a classic case of bioaccumulation. So the grape plant does a similar thing. If you use aluminium company cryolite waste to put as an antifungal agent at the root of the vine, the plant responds by trying to get rid of the poison in the fruit, namely the grape. So in some Californian grape varieties, you will find 12 parts per million in the produced wine. So, but getting back to tea, green tea is more dangerous of some varieties, but you need to look at the individual source. A lot of the fluoride is naturally occurring in the rock at the altitudes where tea is traditionally grown. But green tea can have up to 8,000 parts per million dry weight fluoride. So anyone consuming a large amount of tea, given what I showed you about the breast cancer link studied in Sweden, where Sweden of course had fluoridation banned in 1970, and they're only considering women past that period over 17 years. So it's a very good testbed to compare coffee drinkers that showed no effect and tea drinkers otherwise selected. There's been a similar study of 74,000 women in America following coffee drinking versus tea drinking, and the instance of osteoporosis and related bone disease correlates directly with the daily consumption of tea. So I don't drink tea anymore. My father was diagnosed with chronic kidney disease. He immediately went off tea, and we had to, as an emergency system, arrange for him to drink rainwater for the rest of his life.
So in other words, it's completely useless to use bottled water to boil your water and then add the tea to that.
Exactly, yes.
What about boiled water actually increases the...
Sorry, which tea? Oh, herbals, once again, I won't make a blanket statement, but with the fluoride selective electrode, Declan Woe in Ireland, an environmental scientist, has been testing a large number of fluoride inputs in liquid form, a very wide range of teas, and he even found it in Guinness, much to his disgust. And that is an issue. If it's in your beer and you drink a lot of beer, then you will be getting toxic doses of fluoride, which the fact that we may not have emphasised today is that in a healthy person with healthy kidneys, roughly half of your daily fluoride is with you for life. And in the person with compromised kidneys, and that's over 2 million Australians, you will accumulate perhaps 80 to 90% of the fluoride in every glass of water you drink.
I just wanted to respond to the tea. I was a big tea drinker, and I actually measured the amount in the tea that I made. And one of them I let brew for a long time that had a lot more in. I now drink rooibos tea, Red Bush, which had about approximately 1/10 of the amount that the other teas had. So if that's any help. I didn't test green tea and white tea. People have speculated white tea might be lower. I don't know whether you know, because the leaves are younger. But I believe green tea and black tea are the same. It's just the longer you brew it. And I tried Earl Grey and things like that, and decaf, and to see if those were any different, but they were all the same.
Yes, I don't have figures to hand on herbal tea. As I say, look at the published research. There has been published research on iced teas, which are becoming trendy in your vending machines. They're dangerous. They have dangerous levels of fluoride in them. And so I won't tell you anything about chamomile tea because I just don't know. And I'm a scientist who annoys both my professors and my students by saying, I don't know, let's look it up. And if it can't be looked up, let's do the experiment. This is very rare these days, particularly in the scientists who have shiny bum positions in Canberra.
In regards to the tea, is the fluoride in the plant when it's growing, or is it taking it out of the water you're brewing it in?
No, it's bioaccumulated in and into the fresh grown. So the more expensive teas actually tend to have different levels of fluoride, sometimes higher, sometimes lower, and it is a complicated subject, but in general, consuming large quantities of tea is dangerous to your health. We can say that categorically.
Tea plants naturally absorb what's available in the ground, more than most other plants do. They suck it up and do it.
Just one last comment.
There was a bit of confusion here, I think. As far as the United States is concerned, the EPA regulates contaminants to come up with a safe drinking water standard. And that standard, as you've heard several times, is 4 parts per million. That has nothing to do with water fluoridation. The people that promote water fluoridation, Department of Health and Human Services, they recommend a range of levels for fluoridation between 0.7 and 1.2. That is the recommended range. And that basically is saying that's the range which would lower tooth decay without causing too much dental fluorosis. That's their basic thing. And right now, there's a big ding-dong battle going on about who should regulate the safety of adding something to the water. As I said, the EPA only regulates contaminants, not additives. Now, the Department of Health and Human Services is now saying it's the EPA's job to tell us the safety of additives. And the EPA says, no, if the additive is there to treat health, that's the responsibility of the Food and Drug Administration, which has never in 70 years regulated fluoride toxicity. So I hope that helps to clarify that we can't fluoridate at 4 parts per million. That's a safety standard. If you have more than 4 parts per million, legally you have to take some of it out.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, and thank you, Geoff. Geoff would like to make a comment.
Yeah, just directly related to what Paul was just saying about the American regulatory mess. In Australia, we have the Therapeutic Goods Administration, which completely washes its hand of all issues to do with fluoridation in water. So there is the governing body for therapies, and it says, under no circumstances will we classify that as a therapeutic good. And the reason they won't classify it as a therapeutic good is if they did, proof that it was safe and effective would have to be provided by the suppliers.
Thank you, Geoff. The program did say we have a 10-minute break, but I think we're kind of moving along quite nicely.